Okay, let's go back to John's Gospel. I think this is all really good. There's lots of good things in here in these chapters 12 and 13, but for right now I'd like to turn to chapter 13 and take a look at something. This is an interesting passage here. Chapter 13, beginning with verse 1. John 13, verse 1. And we just saw it dramatized for us. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own, which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. I like another translation that I read once that said this, having loved his own which are in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The phrase, love them to the end, being translated, he showed them the end or the full extent of his love for them. And I like that because what he does now, let's go on reading. Supper having ended, and the devil now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God and went to God, he riseth from supper, and laid aside his garments, and took a towel, and girded himself, and he poureth water into a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Now, what's this all about that Jesus is doing? You see, it's important to call to mind the fact that at this period of time, in these days, they didn't have paved streets. It wasn't usual. I mean, the Romans had paved highways, but in a place like this, it was not usual to have paved streets. Dirt streets, picture dirt streets, and picture men walking around with garments, like they had. They didn't have socks and shoes. They had sandals. Your feet are, exposed in the sandals, and you're walking out in the dirt streets. And not only that, now here's the really terrible part. They didn't have indoor plumbing. They didn't have sewage systems like we have today. And typically what happens, and it's this way today in third world countries, that the sewers are running down the gutters in the street. And so you're walking along in the street as you're going places, and you're no telling what you're stepping on. Your feet are getting dirty, and not just dirt in a polite way, dirty, in a really dirty way. And your feet get really, whatever's in the street gets on your feet. And so now they've come into the house, and typically, in a house that had enough money to afford servants, there's different kinds of servants. There's one kind of servant that might cook, another kind of servant that might be responsible for, cleaning or taking care of things. But the job that no servant wanted, and the lowest of the low, the lowest on the totem pole, so to speak, the lowest job for the servant was the guy who had to get the basin and wash the feet of the guests. He was the one. That's the job nobody wanted. It's like, is it my turn to do that again today? Nobody wants that job. And so Jesus takes the basin and he takes off his outer garments, and he takes on, we might say, the role or the position of the slave, and not only a servant or a slave, but the lowest of the servants. And he gets down on the floor and begins to wash the disciples' feet, and he's washing off of them all the muck. And this wasn't a desirable job at all. The muck and the mess and the grime and all the filth that got on their feet as they were walking out there in the streets. Now, it's interesting on many levels that he does this. First of all, it's interesting because here's what he didn't do. He could have, as the Lord and as this master, he could have said to them, "What's with you, disciples? How dare you come into my presence with these smelly, stinking feet? Don't you know who I am? Why do you come into my presence with this dirt on your feet?" And did you know, the reason I said it that way is that many times people feel that way. Christians feel that way. Sometimes Christians are afraid to go to church because their own conscience condemns them over things they've said or done wrong, and they think God's going to get after them if they come to, or Jesus is going to get on to, if I go to church, I'm going to feel bad. That's not what it's supposed to be at all. In fact, here's Jesus showing us just the opposite point of view. He didn't say to them, "How dare you come into my presence with dirt on your feet?" He got down and took the role of a servant, and he washed his disciples' feet. He did it himself. It's interesting on another level because here's Jesus. We're told elsewhere in Scripture that Jesus is God manifest in the flesh. He said here in these chapters, he said, "If you've seen me, you've seen the one that sent me." Jesus is representing a literal, real representation of the heart of God in action, we might say. And here is God manifest in the flesh. Think about this. Getting on his knees and washing the feet of his creation. What does that tell us about the heart of God towards us? What it tells me, first of all, is there's a depth of love that it's hard for us to comprehend. a greatness and a depth of love that God has for us that it's difficult for us to wrap our minds around. Because Jesus is showing us the heart of God towards us by not condemning the disciples for the dirt on their feet, but getting down and washing it off himself by taking care of it on his own. And he goes and he begins to wash their feet. Notice what Simon says here in verse 6. It's interesting. Then he comes to Simon Peter. Peter said to him, Lord, dost thou wash my feet? Or in other words, are you going to wash my feet? He's surprised here. It's a kind of a surprise. What do you think you're doing, Jesus? You can't wash my feet. Jesus answered and said unto him, What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. In other words, you don't really understand what I'm doing right now. Now he understood he was washing his feet. That he understood. But what he didn't understand was what this meant, what he was showing to him or teaching them by what he was doing. Peter said to him, Thou shalt never wash my feet. Jesus answered and said, If I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. So then Peter goes to the other extreme. He said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. And Jesus said to him, He that is washed need not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit. And you are clean, but not all. Meaning Judas. Now what does he mean by that? He says, if you're clean, or as we saw in the video, if you've had a bath, you don't need to be clean. If you're already clean, you don't need to be clean again except to wash your feet. Now, how did they get clean? And why was Judas? He says, you're all clean, but not all. Why were they clean, and why was Judas not clean? Well, and notice Judas is still here, by the way. When Jesus went and washed their feet, he washed Judas too. Judas hasn't left yet. Think about that now. Jesus knew who would betray him, but he went and fulfilled that role for him also. Think about that, you know. By the way, Jesus didn't just die on the cross for the sins of those who would believe on him. He died for everybody's sins. You know, Jesus loved them all. He even loved Judas here. He even washed the feet of Judas. And that's, again, showing us the depth of his love for all of us. But he says, you are clean, but not all, meaning Judas. Well, why were they clean? Let me tell you why the disciples, in this metaphoric sense, he says they're clean. They're clean because they believed in him. And that was the basis of their being clean. Judas was not clean because he didn't believe in him. That was the basis of his not being clean. It wasn't based on anything other than that.